A young black girl sat alone on a bench, calmly feeding pigeons. She wore casual clothes, but her posture was strong and confident. There was a quiet peace around her, as if she was in her own world, away from the noise of the busy park. People passed by, but she remained still, enjoying the moment. Suddenly, Officer Callum Reed walked into view. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and wore his LAPD uniform like a badge of power. As he saw the young girl sitting alone, something about her made him uneasy. Reed, used to being in control, decided to approach, feeling the need to assert his authority, unaware of who she truly was. Officer Reed took slow, deliberate steps towards the bench where the young black girl sat. His boots echoed against the pavement, drawing attention from those around him. Standing in front of her, he looked down with a smug grin, his arms crossed. He spoke firmly, expecting her to stand up and show some respect for his authority. "You need to move along," he said, his voice laced with impatience. But the girl didn't react. She continued feeding the pigeons, completely ignoring him. She scattered the seeds with calm precision, her focus entirely on the birds. She didn't look up, didn't even flinch at the sound of his voice. Her stillness seemed to confuse Reed, who had expected people to jump at his commands. But this girl was different. She wasn't frightened, nor was she intimidated by the uniform he wore. Reed's expression shifted from a smug grin to a frown. His irritation grew as he stood there, waiting for some sort of response. He couldn't understand why she wasn't following his orders. She was just a young girl, sitting alone in the park, and yet she wasn't reacting to him like everyone else did. Most people, when he spoke to them in that tone, either complied or showed some sign of nervousness. But she remained silent, unaffected. His frustration deepened and his voice grew sharper. "I said move," he repeated, this time stepping closer to the bench, looking down at her with more authority. The girl, however, didn't budge. She was still feeding the pigeons, as calm and composed as before. Reed's pride was beginning to crack. She was ignoring him and he didn't like it. Officer Reed's patience was wearing thin. He couldn't understand why the young black girl wasn't listening to him. He was used to people obeying his commands without question, but she was different. Standing taller now, he crossed his arms and took a step closer to her. His posture became more aggressive and his voice grew louder. "I told you to move. Now get up," he ordered, his tone sharp and demanding. The girl didn't flinch. She didn't look up. She simply continued to feed the pigeons. Her calmness in the face of his anger only seemed to frustrate Reed even more. Every time she released another handful of seeds, it felt like a challenge to him. Why wasn't she afraid? Why wasn't she following his orders? Reed stood directly in front of her, blocking her view of the pigeons. He had expected her to look up, to say something, maybe apologize or even stand up and move. But she didn't. Her hands moved steadily, scattering more seeds onto the ground, completely unfazed by his presence. It was as if he wasn't even there. Reed felt his temper rising. He was a police officer. He had the power to make people listen, to control the situation. But here, in this moment, it felt like that power was slipping away. His eyes narrowed. He could feel the frustration bubbling up inside him. To Reed, it seemed like this young girl was deliberately ignoring him, challenging his authority. He had no time for defiance, especially from someone he saw as an outsider. She didn't belong in his world, and the longer she refused to obey, the angrier he became. Reed's patience was gone. He was done trying to be polite. It was time for her to listen. Officer Reed had reached his breaking point. His patience was gone, and his frustration with the girl had turned into pure anger. He was used to people cowering when he used his authority, but she wasn't doing what he expected. She was still calm, still ignoring him. He couldn't stand it any longer. This time he decided to make her notice him, to force her into submission. With a quick step forward, Reed placed his boot just inches from her shoe, blocking her from any further movement. He stood tall, towering over her, and looked down at her, expecting her to feel the pressure. He was hoping she would look up, maybe apologize or at least show some fear. But the girl still didn't flinch. Instead, she continued feeding the pigeons as if he were just another passerby. His frustration only grew. Feeling like he needed to assert his control once and for all, Reed reached down and grabbed her shoulder, forcefully pulling her to face him. He expected her to flinch, to be startled, or at least to show some sign of submission. That's what always happened when he used his power, but this time was different. The young girl's response was swift, smooth, and precise. Before Reed even realized what was happening, she grabbed his wrist, holding it firmly in her grasp. The motion was so fast and controlled that Reed didn't even have time to react. She didn't struggle, didn't fight. she simply held his wrist with ease, making it clear she wasn't scared of him. It was as if she had anticipated his move before he even made it. Reed's mind raced as he tried to process what had just happened. He couldn't understand how a young girl alone in the park was able to stop him so effortlessly. For the first time, a wave of uncertainty washed over him. His body stiffened and his thoughts turned frantic. He had been the one in control for so long, but now it was as if his authority didn't matter. He wasn't dealing with someone who was intimidated by his uniform or his badge. This girl had just proven she wasn't afraid of him. Reed had made a huge mistake, and he realized too late that this confrontation was not going the way he had planned. The moment Reed tried to assert his dominance, everything shifted. As he struggled to pull his wrist free from the girl's grip, something happened that took him completely by surprise. Without a word, without any sudden movements, the girl performed a swift, effortless motion that Reed couldn't even follow with his eyes. One moment, his baton was securely in his hand, and the next it was gone. In one smooth motion, she had disarmed him, taking the baton from his grip as if it were nothing more than a toy. Reed's mind raced as he stood frozen, his hand now empty. He didn't understand what had just happened. He had trained for years to control situations like this, but in a single instant, a young girl had taken his weapon from him without so much as a struggle. Reed blinked, his brain trying to catch up with what had just occurred. He looked at his empty hand, then down at the girl who was now calmly holding his baton. She didn't look at him with anger or aggression. She simply looked at the baton for a moment, as if she was considering what to do with it. Then, without any hesitation, she dropped it on the ground, letting it clatter against the pavement. The sound of the baton hitting the ground seemed to echo in Reed's mind. He stood there, completely stunned. His heart raced and his breath came faster. This girl, who he had thought was just an ordinary person, was in complete control of the situation. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't fought back in a way he expected. She had simply disarmed him with such fluidity and precision that Reed felt completely powerless. He had been the one in charge, the one who wore the badge, but now he was left standing there looking foolish. As the baton clattered to the ground, the people around them began to notice. The crowd, which had been oblivious to the earlier tension, started to realize that something was happening. The whispers began, soft at first, but growing louder as more people turned to look. They saw the girl standing there, calm and collected, and Reed, the officer who had always been in control, now standing with his hands empty and his confidence crumbling. The power dynamic had shifted. Reed was no longer the authority figure in this situation. The girl had taken that from him in the blink of an eye, and now the crowd saw it too. Reed felt his stomach twist with humiliation as people watched him falter. The eyes of the onlookers seemed to pierce through him, noticing not just the baton on the ground, but the fact that he had lost control, completely and utterly. Reed tried to regain his composure, but the feeling of uncertainty only grew stronger. His confidence had always come from his uniform, his baton, and his gun. But now those symbols of authority seemed useless. The girl hadn't needed any of that to take control of the situation. She had done it with calmness, skill, and an effortless movement. Reed's frustration reached new heights. The humiliation he felt was unbearable, and it was only just beginning. The crowd had fully realized what had just happened, and Reed knew deep down that there was no going back. Reed's mind raced as he tried to think of a way to turn the situation around. He couldn't let this girl continue to make a fool of him. He was an officer of the law and he had to take control. His eyes flicked to his holster where his service weapon was securely strapped. In that moment, it was all he could think about. He had always relied on his weapon to control situations, to maintain his authority. He needed to use it now or he would lose everything. His hand shot to his gun, fingers fumbling as he pulled it from the holster. The weight of it in his hand felt familiar, like a lifeline in the chaos. Reed's breath quickened as he lifted the gun, expecting that this would be the moment the girl would finally back down. But before he could even fully aim the weapon, she was already moving. The girl's reaction was faster than anything Reed could have anticipated. Her movement was smooth and effortless, like she had been trained to respond to a threat just like this. In an instant, she reached out and grabbed his wrist with the same calm precision she had used when she disarmed him earlier. Reed didn't even have time to react as she twisted his arm, taking the gun from his hand with a fluid motion. It happened so quickly that Reed didn't even realize what had happened until it was too late. The gun was now in her grasp and Reed was left standing there, completely empty-handed. He stood frozen for a moment, staring at his hand, which had been holding his weapon just seconds ago. The realization hit him like a ton of bricks. He was completely out of his depth. He had no control over the situation anymore. The girl, who had been so calm and composed the whole time, was now holding his gun as if it were nothing. Reed's body shook with frustration. His muscles tensed and his breath came faster as panic set in. He had always been the one in control. He had the badge, the baton, the gun. That's what made him powerful. But now, everything had been taken from him with such ease. The girl hadn't even broken a sweat. She had done it all with such precision and grace that Reed felt utterly humiliated. His mind raced with thoughts of how to fix this. He could try to grab the gun back, but he knew it was useless. He was too slow, too weak compared to her. The crowd of onlookers was growing and Reed could feel their eyes on him. The whispers were growing louder and Reed knew they were all watching him fail. They had seen him try to assert his authority, and now they were seeing him utterly defeated. He felt trapped. His heart pounded in his chest and his mind went blank. He was no longer the officer in control, but just a man who had been outmatched by someone who didn't need a weapon, a uniform, or a badge to show strength. The humiliation burned in his chest as he realized that the girl had beaten him, not with force but with something far more powerful: calmness, control, and the ability to stay composed in the face of aggression. Reed was now standing in front of the girl, empty-handed, his body trembling. He had nothing left. And the worst part was, he knew it. As Reed stood there, still stunned and powerless, 2 more officers arrived on the scene. They had seen the growing disturbance from a distance and quickly made their way toward the commotion. At first, Reed thought they were coming to back him up, to restore order. But when they saw the young girl standing calmly, holding his baton and gun, everything changed. The 2 officers stopped in their tracks. They didn't immediately approach Reed. Instead, they stood back and exchanged a quick glance, almost as if they were assessing the situation. Reed's confusion deepened. These were fellow officers, people he had worked with, people who should have been on his side. But instead of rushing to his defense, they were looking at the girl, sizing her up. Reed's mind raced, but before he could make sense of it, something clicked in the officers' eyes. They recognized her. It wasn't just the badge or the uniform that gave her power, there was something else. The way she held herself, the calmness in her posture, the quiet confidence in her eyes. It was clear to the officers that she was no ordinary person. She didn't need a badge or a gun to have control over the situation. She carried herself with a quiet authority that Reed had never seen before. She was experienced, calm, and powerful in a way that Reed couldn't begin to comprehend. The officers stood still, almost in awe, as they watched her. Reed's heart sank. He had always believed that the uniform and the badge gave him authority. But these other officers were not even looking at him now. Their attention was fully on the girl, and Reed could feel his authority crumbling. They weren't just recognizing her, they were respecting her. As the realization set in, Reed's grip on his own power faltered. The crowd around them, which had been whispering in the background, grew quieter as the scene unfolded. People were beginning to understand what had happened. They saw Reed, the officer who had always commanded respect, standing defeated and empty-handed. They saw the girl, who hadn't raised her voice or acted aggressively, standing with control. And as they saw the officers defer to her, the weight of the situation settled in. Reed's humiliation deepened as the crowd's gaze shifted from him to the young girl. He could feel the unspoken judgment in the air, the shift in how everyone saw him. He had been the one with the power, but now it was clear that he had lost it. The crowd's murmurs grew as they exchanged looks of disbelief, watching Reed's authority slip away with each passing second. One of the officers, the senior one, stepped forward after a long pause. He didn't speak to Reed, his eyes were on the girl. He nodded in her direction, a small gesture of recognition, and that was all it took. Reed stood frozen, unable to process what was happening. The other officer, a younger man, looked at Reed with a brief glance, but it was clear that he too understood the situation. There was no need for words, nothing had to be said. Reed's failure was evident to everyone. The crowd had already seen it, the power had shifted. Reed no longer held the authority he had once taken for granted. The officer's respect for the girl made it clear that Reed's position had already been replaced. The young girl was the one in control now, and the moment had passed beyond Reed's ability to change it. The senior officer, who had been silently observing the scene, finally spoke. His voice was calm, but it carried authority. He turned to Reed and gave him a direct, unwavering command. "Give me your badge and your weapon," he said. Reed's heart sank as the words hit him. The senior officer wasn't asking, he was telling him. Reed stood there, frozen for a moment, unsure of how to respond. His badge was more than just a symbol, it was everything to him. It defined him, gave him power, and affirmed his place in the world. Without it, who was he? His mind raced, but he knew what he had to do. Slowly, with shaking hands, Reed reached for the badge pinned to his chest. It felt heavier than it ever had before. He unpinned it, the cold metal in his fingers seeming to reflect the weight of his defeat. The pride he once felt when he wore it now felt hollow. With a deep breath, he handed it over to the senior officer. Then Reed reached for his gun. His hand trembled as he grasped the weapon, the one thing that had always made him feel invincible. But now it felt like a burden. He had lost control of everything, and this was just another symbol of that loss. With a heavy heart, he placed the gun in the officer's hands. The act of surrendering his badge and gun was more than just giving up his tools of power, it was the loss of his entire identity. He had spent so many years building himself up, convincing himself that his uniform and his weapon made him someone important. But in that moment he realized how fragile his sense of self had been. He wasn't the officer in charge anymore. He was just a man, humiliated and stripped of everything he once held dear. The senior officer didn't say a word as he took the items from Reed. There was no comfort, no sympathy in his eyes. Reed knew he had failed. The officer turned and nodded to the younger officer, who stepped forward and gently touched Reed's arm, signaling for him to follow. Reed's head hung low as he began to walk away from the scene, his steps slow and heavy. The crowd still watched, some of them now whispering in disbelief at what had just happened. Reed didn't look back. He couldn't. The weight of his surrender was too much to bear, and the humiliation of being escorted out of the park was a devastating blow to his pride and his power. He had lost everything he had fought to protect. The young girl calmly returned to her bench. There was no rush, no sign of triumph. She simply sat back down and resumed her peaceful activity, scattering bird seed onto the ground for the pigeons. Her movements were slow and deliberate, as though nothing had happened. She wasn't disturbed by the chaos that had unfolded around her. The tension, the confrontation, and the humiliation Reed had just experienced seemed to have no impact on her. Her presence in that moment was almost otherworldly. While the world around her seemed to spiral into confusion, she remained unmoved, as still and composed as before. Her calmness, her strength, was a quiet force that no one could deny. She didn't need to raise her voice or throw a single punch to show her power. Her inner peace and confidence were enough to command the room. She had proven, without even trying, that true strength comes from within. The park, meanwhile, continued on as if nothing had happened. People resumed their walks, the joggers continued their routes, and the sounds of the city drifted in the background. But for those who had witnessed the scene, nothing would ever be the same. The onlookers who had watched the encounter now looked at the girl with a new sense of respect and awe. They had seen someone stand her ground, someone who could face authority with unwavering calmness and stillness. She was a reminder that power doesn't always have to come from loud gestures or physical force. It can come from composure, confidence, and the ability to remain true to yourself no matter the circumstances. And now, I want to hear from you. What was the most shocking part of this encounter? Was it the way the girl handled the situation with such calm? Or was it Reed's complete loss of control? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear what you think. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Sharing this with friends can help keep these conversations going, and subscribing will ensure you don't miss out on future stories that challenge the way we think about power, authority, and strength. Thanks for watching, and until next time, stay strong and stay true to yourself.